The crystal chandelier above the dining table cast a golden glow over everything it touched. The white linen tablecloth, the bone china plates, the polished silverware that had never once been used for anything resembling a real meal. In the Williams-Carter household, dinner was not about food. It was about performance. It was about showing the world, and each other, exactly who they believed themselves to be. Naomi Carter sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast slightly downward the way she had trained herself to sit over 4 years of marriage. She wore a simple cotton dress, pale blue, the kind you could find on clearance at any mid-range department store. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat twist. No jewelry except for a thin gold band on her left hand that had been losing its shine for the past 2 years. To anyone looking, she appeared to be exactly what her husband had always told her she was. Plain, ordinary, forgettable. At the other end of the table, Marcus Carter was everything Naomi was not, or so he believed with a conviction that bordered on religious devotion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His watch was a Patek Philippe, his shoes hand-stitched Italian leather, his haircut maintained by a barber who charged $300 per visit and was booked 3 months in advance. Marcus Carter had built himself from the ground up, a boy from the south side of Chicago who clawed his way into real estate development, who had willed himself into money through sheer relentless ambition. And he wore every dollar of that journey on the outside, where everyone could see it. Between them, seated to Marcus's right, was a woman named Simone Vance. She was striking in the way that required effort to maintain: long sculptured nails, a fitted red bandage dress, lashes that needed their own introduction when she walked into a room. She laughed at everything Marcus said. She touched his arm when she passed the bread basket. He had been a constant presence in their home for the past 8 months, always introduced as his business associate, always staying just a few minutes longer than necessary, always finding reasons to lean in close enough for her perfume to linger on his collar. Naomi had seen all of it. She had said nothing, because in this house, silence was the only currency she had left. Marcus cleared his throat and set down his wine glass with the particular kind of authority that preceded bad news. He had been building to this all evening. Naomi could tell by the way he had barely looked at her during the appetizers, the way Simone kept glancing at her with something close to pity, the way the tension in the room had been stretched so tight it hummed. "Naomi," he said, his voice carrying the measured calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "I think you already know what I'm going to say." She looked up then, slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. "Then say it, Marcus." He straightened in his chair. "I've had my attorney prepare the papers. I want a divorce. I've been unhappy for a long time, and I think on some level you've known that. I need to be with someone who matches where I am in life. Someone who can actually stand beside me in the rooms I walk into. I'm sorry, but you're not that person." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Simone picked up her wine glass and looked at the chandelier, as if fascinated suddenly by its construction. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dupree, who had been quietly refilling water glasses near the sideboard, went completely still. Naomi did not move. She did not cry. She did not even blink. She simply looked at her husband, this man she had loved, this man she had built a quiet life beside, this man who had spent 4 years slowly, methodically convincing her that her worth was determined by what she could offer him, and she felt something settle inside her. Something ancient and certain, like the click of a key turning in a lock. "You want someone who can stand beside you in the rooms you walk into," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of each word. "That's right," Marcus said, his chin lifting slightly. "The world I move in requires a certain presence, a certain understanding of how things work at the top. You're a sweet woman, Naomi, but you've never fit into that world. You never will." Something almost imperceptible shifted in Naomi's expression then. The corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. Something in between. Something that, had Marcus been paying closer attention, should have given him pause. "Okay, Marcus," she said quietly. If that's what you want. He blinked, clearly expecting more resistance. Tears, perhaps. Pleading. Maybe even rage. What he got instead was the quiet dignity of a woman who had already made peace with something he did not yet understand. He pushed an envelope across the table toward her. My attorney put together a very fair settlement. There's $30,000, and you can keep the car. I think that's more than generous given. Given what? She asked. Given that you didn't exactly bring much to the table, Marcus said, and the words landed with a particular cruelty that he seemed entirely unaware of, the kind of cruelty that lives in a man so long it becomes invisible to him. Naomi looked at the envelope. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Simone, who was now studying her manicure with focused intensity. Then Naomi pushed her chair back and stood. She was not tall, but in that moment she seemed to take up more space than the room could comfortably hold. Keep your $30,000, Marcus, she said, her voice soft and absolutely steady. And keep your settlement. I don't need it. She placed her ring, the thin gold band that had been losing its shine, on the table beside her plate. Then she picked up her handbag, a worn leather tote that Marcus had always found embarrassing, and she walked out of the dining room. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor of the hallway. The front door opened. The front door closed. The sound echoed through the house like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. Marcus stared at the ring on the table. Then he reached for his wine glass and drank deeply. Well, he said to Simone, who finally looked up from her nails. That went better than I expected. Simone smiled. She's not going to be a problem, she said. Women like that never are. Neither of them noticed Mrs. Dupree standing at the sideboard, her water pitcher held still in both hands, watching the empty doorway where Naomi had just walked through. And neither of them saw the expression on Mrs. Dupree's face. Not sadness exactly, but something close to the look a person wears when they are watching someone walk off the edge of a cliff in slow motion, knowing it is already too late to call out a warning. They would understand soon enough. To understand what Naomi Carter was, you first had to understand what she had chosen not to be. She was born Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes, the only child of Dr. Gerald Barnes and Constance Whitfield-Barnes, in a sprawling stone estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, on a Tuesday morning in late October, while a thunderstorm rolled across the Georgia hills and knocked out power to half the county. Her father had joked, for years afterward, that even the electricity knew when something important was happening. Naomi had always found that story embarrassing in the way that only people who love their parents deeply can find a story embarrassing. The Whitfield family was not the kind of old money that needed to announce itself. It was the kind that had been quietly accumulating for 5 generations, passed from one careful hand to the next, grown and diversified and protected with the same disciplined intentionality that lesser men gave to prayer. Naomi's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Ida Whitfield, had been one of the first black women in the state of Georgia to hold a commercial property deed, purchased in 1918 with money she had earned as a seamstress and invested into a laundry service that served Atlanta's finest hotels. From that single deed, from those callous hands, an empire had slowly and steadily grown. By the time Naomi was born, the Whitfield family holdings included commercial real estate in 4 states, a private equity stake in 3 regional banks, a century-old textile manufacturing company, a boutique hotel chain spanning the Southeast, and a family foundation that had quietly funded black college scholarships for 40 years without ever seeking a single press release. The family's net worth, carefully managed and rarely discussed in public, sat well north of $2 billion. Naomi had grown up knowing all of this, and she had spent most of her adult life making absolutely certain that no one outside of her family circle knew it about her. This was not cowardice. It was a lesson her mother had taught her early and forcefully, seated at the kitchen table of their Buckhead estate, while 8-year-old Naomi worked on a homework assignment about community helpers. Baby, Constance had said, setting down her tea, let me tell you something about this world. People who know what you have will spend the rest of their lives deciding what you owe them. People who love who you are will spend the rest of their lives figuring out how to be worthy of you. You want the second kind, and the only way to find them is to make sure they don't know about the first kind. 8-year-old Naomi had not fully understood. But 28-year-old Naomi, the one who had walked out of Marcus Carter's dining room with her wedding ring left on the table, understood completely. She had met Marcus at a charity gala 6 years ago, back when she was working as a graphic designer at a small creative studio in Midtown Atlanta, living in a modest apartment in Edgewood, driving a 10-year-old Volvo that she genuinely loved. She had chosen that life deliberately, the small apartment, the ordinary job, the worn-in car. She was testing something. Testing whether she could be loved for nothing more than herself. Whether a man could look at plain Naomi with her cotton dresses and her second-hand furniture and choose her anyway. Marcus had been charming that night. Ambitious, funny, quick-witted, with a warmth in his smile that seemed to reach his eyes when he wasn't being observed. He had complimented her earrings, small hand-painted clay pieces she had made herself in a ceramics glass, and seemed genuinely interested when she explained the technique. He had found her at the end of the evening and asked for her number without the performative confidence that most men in that room wore like a second suit. He seemed, in that moment, like a man who was still becoming himself. She had fallen for the man he was still becoming. The tragedy was that she had not accounted for the possibility that he might stop in the middle of the journey, decide he had arrived, and turn around to look back at everything he had outgrown. In the early years, there had been real love. She was certain of that. Evenings cooking together in his small apartment kitchen, sharing a single pair of earbuds to listen to music while they made dinner. Sunday mornings in Piedmont Park, talking about everything and nothing, watching dogs chase each other across the grass. The first time she had brought him to her parents' house in Buckhead, the modest guest house on the property, carefully chosen for exactly this occasion, and watched him fall in love with her mother's cooking and her father's stories. He had been easy and open that day, comfortable in his own skin in a way she found beautiful. But money had a way of changing the temperature of a room without ever turning up the heat. As Marcus's business grew, as the deals got larger and the zip codes he moved in became more exclusive, something inside him shifted. The warmth did not disappear exactly, it redirected. It began flowing outward, toward the world, toward perception, toward the careful construction and maintenance of an image. And it pulled away from the quiet corners of their life together, from her earrings and her Saturday morning hair and her clearance rack dresses, from the parts of her that had nothing to do with how things looked from the outside. He began suggesting things, gently at first. Have you thought about getting your hair done professionally? I'm taking you to a client dinner next week. Then more directly. I really think you should let my stylist put you together for the gala, baby. This is a big deal for my reputation. Then without any attempt at gentleness at all. Naomi, you cannot wear that. You look like you just came from the grocery store. Do you understand what these people will think? She had absorbed it all. Quietly. With a patience that he mistook for acceptance, and she knew was something else entirely. Observation. She was watching him. Not with hatred or bitterness, but with a growing, crystalline clarity about who he was becoming, what he valued, where the limits of his sight actually ended. She had never told him about the Whitfield family fortune. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she was testing the hypothesis her mother had given her. And 4 years of marriage had given her a result that was both devastating and clarifying. Marcus Carter did not love her. He loved the idea of a woman who completed his image. And Naomi, in her cotton dresses and quiet dignity, had failed that particular standard so thoroughly that he was now prepared to hand her $30,000 and a used car and call it even. What he did not know, what he had never had the curiosity or the humility to even wonder about, was that the woman he was dismissing as not bringing much to the table was, in fact, the table itself. The story broke on a Thursday. Not in the way that most Atlanta society stories broke, through whisper networks and carefully worded texts between women at the same spin class. It broke loudly, publicly, in the way that only happens when a man has made himself large enough that his stumbles are visible from a distance. Marcus Carter had, in the weeks following the dinner party divorce, made several errors in judgment that compounded on each other with the efficiency of falling dominoes. The first was telling people, not just Simone, not just his business partner, a man named Darius Webb, who had known Naomi and always privately suspected that Marcus didn't deserve her. Marcus had told everyone. At the gym. At the barber. At networking events where men like him gathered to talk about how hard they had worked and what they had built. He had told the story of his divorce the way a man tells the story of finally trading in an old car, with relief, with a kind of performative relief, with the implication that he had been tolerating something for far too long and had finally had the good sense to upgrade. "She's a sweet girl," he would say, swirling his cognac. "But she was never in my lane. You know how it is. You reach a certain level and you have to make choices about who you're going to bring with you." He said these things in rooms full of people who nodded and smiled and said nothing. He did not notice that the nods were not the same as agreement. He did not notice that some of those people knew things he didn't. He was too busy being right to notice he was standing at the edge of something. The second error was Simone. Specifically, the pace at which Simone moved into his home. Within 2 weeks of the divorce filing, her clothes were in Naomi's closet and her name was on the Ring doorbell's approved list. Within a month, she was accompanying him to the kind of business dinners where spouses were traditionally expected. This was not inherently problematic. It was the brazenness of it, the speed of it, the way it communicated to everyone who saw it that the dissolution of his marriage had been premeditated rather than arrived at reluctantly. The third error was the one that would define everything that followed. A journalist named Kayla Monroe, who wrote a column for Atlanta Business Weekly called The Real Deals, had been working on a profile of the Carter Group, Marcus's real estate development firm, for nearly 4 months. The piece was supposed to be a largely flattering overview of his rise, a portrait of self-made success in the new Atlanta. Kayla was thorough. She was also, as it happened, the younger sister of a woman who had gone to college with Naomi Whitfield-Barnes. Kayla had not set out to find the story she found. But a good journalist doesn't choose her stories. The stories choose her. It started with a routine call to Naomi, reached through her sister, simply to ask if she would comment on her ex-husband's business for the profile. Naomi had declined, politely, warmly, with no bitterness in her voice. But something in that conversation had set off a quiet alarm in Kayla's mind. There was something about the cadence of Naomi's speech, measured, assured, the particular confidence of someone who has never had to prove anything, that didn't match the portrait Marcus had been painting of his quiet, ordinary, out-of-her-depth ex-wife. Kayla Monroe was nothing if not thorough. She started digging. What she found, in property records and corporate filings and foundation board minutes and a very illuminating afternoon spent with a retired attorney who had worked for the Whitfield family for 30 years, rewrote everything. The piece that eventually ran on a Thursday morning, under the headline, "The Heiress He Didn't Know He Married," was not a business profile at all. It was something much more interesting than that. Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes, the article explained, was the sole heir to the Whitfield-Barnes family estate, one of Atlanta's oldest and most quietly formidable black family fortunes. The Whitfield Holdings portfolio, managed through a private trust over which Naomi held primary beneficiary status, included commercial real estate with an assessed value exceeding $300 million, equity stakes in financial institutions across 3 states, and controlling interest in the Whitfield Foundation, which had disbursed over $40 million in charitable grants over the preceding decade. The article noted, with particular care, that Marcus Carter had been married to this woman for 4 years. That he had reportedly initiated a divorce settlement offering her $30,000. That he had, according to multiple sources quoted anonymously, spent the weeks following his divorce filing publicly characterizing his ex-wife as someone who had never fit into his world. The final line of the article was 3 words long. She declined comment. By 9 o'clock that Thursday morning, the article had been shared 47,000 times. By noon, it was the #1 trending topic on Black Twitter, which is a very specific kind of viral that operates at a speed and intensity that has no equivalent anywhere else on the internet. By 3 o'clock, it had been picked up by 3 national news outlets. By evening, Marcus Carter's name was being spoken in living rooms and office break rooms and beauty salons from Atlanta to Los Angeles, always preceded by a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Marcus found out about the article at 7:43 a.m., sitting in his kitchen in his bathrobe, reading his phone over a cup of coffee. He had 4 new voicemails from Darius Webb, 7 text messages from business associates, and an email from his attorney with the subject line, "Urgent, we need to talk today." He sat very still for a long time. The coffee went cold. Simone came downstairs in a silk robe, glanced at his face, and quietly went back upstairs. Marcus Carter, who had spent his entire adult life building himself into a man who could not be embarrassed, was experiencing what it feels like when the floor you thought was solid simply isn't there anymore. It would be too simple to say that Marcus Carter's life fell apart after the divorce. The truth is more complicated and more instructive than that. For the first few weeks, those golden weeks before the article, before the world turned its light on what he had done, Marcus had felt something that he privately and embarrassingly recognized as joy. Not the deep, rooted kind of joy that comes from being known and choosing to stay. The lighter, more volatile kind. The kind that comes from escape. From the sensation of dropping weight you had carried for so long you forgot it was there. He had come home from the office every evening to a house that smelled like Simone's perfume instead of the faint vanilla scent of the candles Naomi had always kept burning. The closet was reorganized, filled with Simone's clothes and shoes, the kind of wardrobe that announced itself loudly, that matched the version of Marcus's life he had always wanted to project. On the occasions when Simone accompanied him to events, he noticed the way other men looked at her, the way they leaned in during handshakes, the slight voltage of envy in their eyes. He mistook this for admiration of his own choices. He filed it away as evidence that he had made the right decision. He had even, in a moment of weakness, called his mother to tell her about the divorce. His mother, a quiet woman from the South Side who had worked double shifts for 20 years to keep him in school and had opinions she delivered with the precision of a surgeon, had said only, "Marcus, have you met that woman's family?" "Mama, I've been married to her for 4 years." "That's not what I asked you. Have you met her family? Do you know where she comes from?" She was modest about it. "You know how she is. Her parents are retired educators." His mother had made a sound that defied phonetic representation. It was the sound of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the specific melody of her child walking toward a cliff. She did not say anything else. She said goodnight and hung up. Marcus had dismissed it. His mother worried too much. She had always been too careful, too suspicious of good fortune. He was building something real. He knew what he was doing. The cracks appeared the way they always do, small, innocuous, the kind you can explain away if you're motivated to do so. His biggest current development project, a luxury mixed-use complex in Buckhead called the Meridian, had been moving through the city's permitting process for 18 months. 3 weeks after the divorce was filed, the permit stalled. His contact at the Planning Commission, a man named Harold Osei who had always been reliably cooperative, stopped returning calls with the same speed. When they finally connected, Harold was polite but noticeably cooler. The permits were delayed due to a community impact review. "These things take time, Marcus. You know how it is." Marcus did not yet make the connection. 2 of his key investors, men who had backed 2 of his previous developments with 8-figure commitments, sent emails within the same week expressing that they were reassessing their portfolio priorities and would not be participating in the Meridian at their originally committed level. Their combined withdrawal represented a $22 million funding gap that Marcus's financing structure had not been designed to absorb. Marcus called Darius Webb, his business partner, to strategize. Darius listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions, and then said something that Marcus didn't understand until much later. "Marcus," Darius said, "you know that Naomi's grandfather, Gerald Barnes Sr., helped build half the banking relationships this city runs on, right? The kind of relationships where a phone call from the right person can move money toward a project or away from it, without anyone ever having to explain why. Naomi's grandfather has been dead for 12 years, Marcus said. "He built something that outlasted him," Darius said quietly. "That's what old money does, Marcus. It keeps working after the people are gone. The question you should be asking yourself is whether you understand what kind of world you just stepped into." Marcus hung up and poured himself a drink. He told himself Darius was being dramatic. He told himself that investors pulled back from deals all the time. He told himself that the permit delay was a bureaucratic snarl, nothing more. He told himself the story he needed to believe, because the alternative, that a woman he had dismissed as ordinary, as unworthy, as someone who had never fit into his world, was actually someone with more reach and more power than he had ever possessed, was a story his ego could not survive without reconstruction. He bought Simone a Cartier bracelet instead. It felt like an answer to a question he was not ready to hear. The article changed everything with a sudden completeness that left Marcus feeling, for the first time in his adult life, that he had no idea where he was standing. His phone did not stop ringing. Clients, business contacts, people he had not spoken to in years who were calling with the thinly veiled pretense of checking in, when really they were confirming with their own ears what they had just read. Every conversation had the same particular undertone, the suppressed, almost electric amusement of people witnessing a very public and very complete reversal of fortune. "Marcus," said one of his most significant clients, a man named Terence Okafor, who headed a commercial property management group and was responsible for nearly a third of the Carter Group's annual revenue. "I've been seeing the news. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Marcus said. "It's being blown out of proportion." "Of course," Terence said, in the tone of a man who completely disagrees but has decided not to spend his energy on it. "Listen, we're going to need to push back the timeline on the Henderson Street project. Just some internal things we're sorting through. I'll have my assistant reach out to Darius." The Henderson Street project was a $40 million contract, the largest the Carter Group had ever landed. Marcus spent an hour trying to reach Terence Okafor's cell phone directly. Terence did not answer. His assistant called back the following day and confirmed the project was being indefinitely postponed. Darius came to the office in person that afternoon, which he almost never did since they had moved to mostly remote operations. He sat across from Marcus's desk without being invited to and looked at his partner with an expression that contained equal parts sympathy and something harder to name. "Talk to me," Darius said. "There's nothing to talk about. Marcus, Henderson Street just pulled back. The Meridian financing is down $22 million. The Buckhead permits have been stalled for a month with no movement. And your name is currently the punchline of every conversation happening in every black boardroom in the city." Darius paused. "There is quite a lot to talk about." Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Outside his office window, Atlanta spread itself across the Georgia hills in the late afternoon light, all gleaming glass towers and deep green trees and the particular chaotic beauty of a city that was always reinventing itself. He had loved this view for years. It had always felt like a promise. Now it looked like something else. Evidence, perhaps, of how far you could fall from how high up. "What do you want me to say, Darius?" "I want you to say you understand what's happening. The people pulling back from your deals, half of them have either done business with the Whitfield Foundation or they do business with people who do. That's not coincidence. That's relationship capital, and you just burned a bridge to the family that holds more of it than almost anyone in this city." "She wouldn't," Marcus said, though he sounded less certain than he intended. "Naomi's not vindictive. That's not who she is. Maybe not. But her father is. And her mother definitely is. And you handed them every reason they'd ever need." Darius stood. "You had the most valuable asset in Atlanta in your living room for 4 years, and you told her she wasn't good enough for your table." He picked up his jacket. "I'm going to focus on damage control. But Marcus, I need you to understand that some of this may not be fixable. Not because of money, because of trust. And you can't buy trust back." After Darius left, Marcus sat alone in the office for a long time. The city lights came on one by one as the sky darkened. He thought about Naomi at that dinner table, about the way she had looked at him when he'd said she had never brought much to the table, about the expression on her face, not wounded, not angry, just certain, the way a person looks when they know something you don't. He had thought it was the look of resignation. He understood now that it was the look of patience. The first time Marcus truly understood the magnitude of what he had thrown away, it happened in a room he had spent 5 years trying to get into. The Peachtree Society was Atlanta's most exclusive black business networking circle. Not a formal organization with membership fees and newsletters. Those things were for people trying to build prestige. The Peachtree Society was the kind of thing that existed precisely because it had never been announced. You knew about it if you were part of it. You aspired to it if you weren't. And you never got in unless someone vouched for you. Marcus had been trying to get into the Peachtree Society for 5 years. He knew it existed. He knew Terrence Okafor was part of it. He knew that the deals made in those rooms, always private, always residential, always with people who had known each other across generations, were the deals that built the real Atlanta, the one behind the glittering surface that tourists and newcomers saw. He had never been invited. He had also never, until the night of Kayla Monroe's article, understood why. 2 weeks after the article ran, Marcus received an unexpected call from a man named James Whitfield, Naomi's uncle, her father's younger brother, who managed the western portion of the family's real estate holdings from an office in Midtown, and who Marcus had met exactly once, briefly, at a family dinner early in his marriage. James Whitfield had a voice that was always slightly amused, as if he were watching a film he had already seen. "Marcus," James said. "You remember me?" "Of course." "James, how are you?" "I'm well. I'm always well. I'm calling because I think you might be confused about a few things, and I believe in clarity. So let me give you some, as a courtesy." Marcus said nothing. He felt something tighten in his chest. "My niece," James said, "has never asked any member of this family to make a single phone call on her behalf. Not one. She's not built that way. She's always been exactly like her mother. She believes the world reveals people to themselves given enough time, and she prefers to let that process run uninterrupted. I want you to understand that whatever is currently happening to your business is a function of who you are, not anything she has done. The world is simply showing you to yourself, Marcus. The way it always does, eventually, to everyone." Marcus swallowed. "Why are you calling me?" "Because," James said, and here his voice shifted from amused to something flatter and more precise. "I want you to understand something that you clearly did not understand during 4 years of marriage, and I feel it's only fair that at least one person says it to you plainly. The Whitfield-Barnes family has been quietly building and protecting one of the most significant black economic legacies in this region for over 100 years. We have relationships with institutions, families, and individuals in this city that predate anything you have built or ever will build. When you decided to dismiss my niece as someone who didn't bring enough to your table, you were making a statement about your values and your judgment. And the people in this city who have known our family for decades have heard that statement clearly. They are responding to it accordingly. Not because of us. Because of you." The line was quiet for a moment. "I just wanted you to know," James said pleasantly, "that the door you thought you were opening when you left Naomi was the door to a room you'll never get into now. Have a good evening." The call ended. Marcus set his phone face down on the table and did not move for a very long time. The next revelation came not from a person but from a building. Marcus had been meeting with an architect to redesign the proposal for the Meridian, the Buckhead project, hoping to make it compelling enough to attract replacement financing and perhaps restart the stalled permitting process. The architect, a man named Cole Patterson who was known for doing historically sensitive work in Atlanta's older neighborhoods, had suggested meeting at the site itself to discuss integration with the surrounding architectural context. The site was a triangular lot at the junction of Peachtree Road and a smaller avenue, bordered on two sides by older buildings that the Planning Commission had flagged as part of the historic consideration for the Community Impact Review. Marcus had driven past these buildings 100 times. He knew them the way you know wallpaper, as background, as context, as things that existed before him and therefore did not need to be studied. Cole Patterson walked Marcus to the corner building, a beautiful 4-story brick structure, craftsman windows, a carved lintel above the entrance, well maintained in a way that old buildings rarely were. "You see the cornerstone there?" Cole said, pointing to the base of the building's front facade. Marcus looked. Carved into the granite, W.B. Commercial Properties, EST 1951. W.B. Whitfield-Barnes. That whole block, Cole said, gesturing down the street, is Whitfield-Barnes Holdings. Has been since the 50s. The Planning Commission flagged your development because any excavation or construction along that boundary requires consent from the adjacent property owners. And the adjacent property owner, as far as I can tell from the records, is a private trust called the Whitfield-Barnes Family Holdings Trust. Marcus stared at the carved cornerstone. The afternoon sun hit it at an angle that made the letters seem to glow. 50 years. This family had owned this land for 50 years before he was born. His entire development career, the deals, the press coverage, the reputation he had constructed so carefully, had been taking place on the edges of a map he hadn't even known existed. Who is the trustee? Marcus heard himself asking. Cole checked his notes. Primary beneficiary and co-trustee is listed as Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes Carter, though I imagine that last name is changing now. Marcus turned away from the building. He walked back to his car without saying anything. Cole called after him, asking when they should schedule a follow-up. Marcus did not answer. He sat in his car for 11 minutes. The city moved around him in its ordinary, indifferent way, a bus exhaling at a stop, a woman in scrubs walking quickly past, a food truck making its slow-rolling afternoon rounds. The world was performing its daily operations with total unconcern for the fact that Marcus Carter had just spent the past 4 years sleeping in the same bed as a woman whose family had built the ground beneath his feet. He had called her plain. He had told her she would never fit into his world. He had offered her $30,000 and a used car and told himself he had been generous. The thing about arrogance, the particular, refined variety that Marcus Carter had cultivated over a lifetime of proving himself, was that it did not go gently. It fought. It reframed. It found explanations. Even now, sitting in this car with the cornerstone burned into his vision, part of him was constructing a narrative in which he was still, in some essential way, right. In which the circumstances were unfair. In which he had been deceived. But somewhere beneath that noise, quieter and more honest, another voice was saying something else. The voice that sounded like his mother on the phone. The voice that sounded like Darius across the office desk. The voice that sounded, most uncomfortably, like Naomi at the dinner table, looking at him with that expression that he now understood had not been resignation at all. That voice said, "You knew who she was. Not her name, not her money, but who she was. You saw it every day. You chose not to value it. And that choice was entirely yours." The full story of Naomi's emergence into her own name, into all of it, the wealth and the legacy and the identity she had spent 4 years carefully holding at a distance from her marriage, did not happen at once. It happened the way things that were always true tend to happen when they are finally allowed, gradually, then suddenly, in a way that made people feel they should have seen it all along. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Naomi drove to Buckhead. Not to the guest house this time. To the main estate. The one she had grown up in, with its stone walls and its long front drive lined with magnolia trees that were older than anyone living had any memory of, with the wraparound porch where her grandmother had shelled peas on summer evenings while listening to the Atlanta Braves on the radio. Home. Her mother was in the kitchen when she arrived. Constance Whitfield-Barnes was 71 years old, lean and precise, with silver locks that fell past her shoulders and reading glasses she wore on a chain of hammered gold. She looked at her daughter for a moment, said nothing, and then opened her arms. Naomi held on for a long time. "I'm not going to say I told you so," Constance said against her daughter's hair. "You told me so," Naomi said. "I said I wasn't going to." They laughed, and it was real laughter, the kind that comes after something hard is over, the involuntary release of tension that the body has been holding too long. Naomi's father, Dr. Gerald Barnes, appeared in the doorway with a kitchen towel over his shoulder and the careful expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time and did not want to ruin it by showing how relieved he was. "You're staying for dinner," he said. It was not a question. she'd stay for a week. In that week, in the home where she had been shaped, surrounded by the quiet that only exists in places that have been loved for generations, Naomi began the process of becoming herself again fully. Not the selected self she had taken into her marriage, edited and simplified for a man who never deserved the full version, but the whole woman, the one with roots going down 100 years into Georgia's soil. The one who understood that wealth was a tool and not an identity, but that dignity was non-negotiable. The family's attorney, a woman named Dr. Patricia Gaines, the Whitfield family's counsel for 30 years, met with Naomi over 2 of those 7 days. The meetings were long and methodical, covering the details of Naomi's formal assumption of her full beneficiary status in the family trust, now that she was no longer in a marriage whose dissolution had required the most careful of financial installations. The numbers, laid out in orderly columns on Dr. Gaines's legal pad, were staggering even to Naomi, who had always been somewhat removed from the mechanics of what the family held. Liquid assets and investment accounts, approximately $340 million. Real estate holdings, assessed value, approximately $480 million. Private equity stakes in financial institutions, approximately $160 million. The Whitfield Foundation's endowment, approximately $90 million. The textile manufacturing company, Whitfield Fabrics, with operations in 4 states, approximately $70 million in assessed value. Total, at current valuation, approximately $1.1 billion. Naomi had known the family was wealthy. She had known in the abstract, practiced way that you know the temperature of water you haven't yet touched. Seeing it written out was something different. Seeing it as hers, not as something inherited passively, not as something that happened to her, but as something she was now responsible for, something she would carry forward and protect and deploy with the same careful intention that 5 generations of her family had brought to it, was transformative in a way she had not expected. She sat with it. She held the weight of it the way you hold something precious and heavy, feeling where it presses, adjusting your grip. Then she called her team. Not staff. Team. The distinction mattered, and she had always been careful about it. There was Dr. Gaines, the attorney. There was Marcus Hendry, the chief investment officer who had managed the family's portfolio for 2 decades with a caution and a brilliance that had doubled it in that time. There was Yolanda Cross, who ran the Whitfield Foundation and who had been Naomi's closest friend since childhood. There was James, her uncle, who knew everyone worth knowing in every room that mattered. And there was her father, who would always be her North Star. They met in the library of the Buckhead estate, around a table that had seen 5 generations of Whitfield family decisions, and they talked for 6 hours. When they were finished, they had the outline of a plan that would, over the following months, unfold with a quiet inevitability that would leave Atlanta's business community alternately awed and chastened. Naomi drove home from Buckhead in her old Volvo, windows down, Atlanta night air filling the car. She felt, for the first time in 4 years, entirely and completely like herself. The first public indication of what was coming appeared on a Monday morning, in the form of a press release issued by the Whitfield-Barnes Family Trust. The release was terse, professional, and carried the particular gravity of words chosen by people who rarely needed to speak publicly because the world already listened when they did. It announced that the trust was making a series of strategic investments in Atlanta's commercial real estate market, focusing specifically on the Buckhead corridor, and that these investments would be coordinated through a newly formed entity called Whitfield Horizon Properties, led by Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes in her capacity as primary trustee. The second paragraph announced that Whitfield Horizon had entered into a definitive agreement to acquire 3 adjacent commercial properties on Peachtree Road, including the triangular corner lot that Marcus Carter had been attempting to develop as the Meridian, for a consideration of approximately $68 million. Marcus Carter read the press release sitting at his office desk. He read it twice. Then he set it down carefully, as if it might break. His lot. His project. The development he had spent 18 months fighting through permitting for, that had hemorrhaged investors, that had become the visible centerpiece of his current professional humiliation, had been purchased by his ex-wife. Not as revenge. The language made that clear. The press release was entirely forward-looking, describing a vision for the corridor that included mixed-income housing, community foundation partnerships, and a design that honored the historic character of the existing Whitfield-Barnes buildings. It was thoughtful. It was visionary. It was executed with the kind of ease that only comes from having real resources and real relationships and a complete absence of anything to prove. She had not bought the lot to hurt him. She had bought it because it was a good investment that fit the family's existing footprint in the corridor. The fact that it also happened to be the project he had staked his professional reputation on was simply geography. That somehow was worse. Over the next several months, Naomi moved with a deliberate, unhurried confidence that Atlanta's business community found both commanding and somewhat awe-inspiring. She appeared at the Peachtree Society's autumn dinner, as a guest of Terence Okafor, who had known her family since she was in grade school, in a midnight blue gown that was understated and exquisite, her natural hair styled in elaborate braids threaded with small gold cuffs, her grandmother's pearl earrings at her ears. She moved through the room the way people move when they have nothing to perform, no image to maintain, no version of themselves to sell. She was simply, completely present. People who had never met her came up to be introduced. Not because of the article, not because of the trust holdings, not because of Marcus's public disaster, but because of the way she occupied a room. There was a quality to her that the wealthy and powerful recognized instinctively, the quality of someone who had grown up around real power and understood, bone deep, the difference between the kind that needed to announce itself and the kind that simply was. She gave a speech that evening at the Society's annual recognition dinner. It was not long. It was 8 minutes exactly. She spoke about her great-great-grandmother Ida and the deed purchased in 1918. About the compounding nature of disciplined, community-rooted investment. About the responsibility that came with holding generational wealth. The responsibility not to hoard it or display it but to deploy it with intention, to use it as a multiplier for the community that had sustained the family across 100 years. When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat longer than applause usually waits. Then it came up loud and sustained, from people who did not applaud easily. A woman seated near the back of the room, whose name Naomi did not yet know, leaned to her companion and said quietly, "Where has she been?" The companion, who had, coincidentally, been at Marcus and Naomi's wedding 4 years prior, replied with a smile, "Waiting." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes relocated her primary residence to the Buckhead estate, took formal occupancy of her late grandmother's suite on the 3rd floor, a sun-drenched series of rooms overlooking the garden, lined with bookshelves and old photographs, and began, in earnest, the work of stepping into the full scope of what she had inherited. Whitfield Horizon Properties broke ground on the Peachtree Corridor development in the spring, with a ceremony attended by the mayor, 3 city council members, and a gathering of the neighborhood's longtime residents who had been advocating for exactly this kind of investment for over a decade. Naomi spoke at the groundbreaking in her hard hat and construction boots, her natural hair wrapped in a bold print scarf, and she spoke directly to the older residents in the front row, the people who had watched their neighborhood change around them for 30 years, and told them that this development existed because of them, that it would be accountable to them, that the Whitfield family's commitment to this block was not a newcomer's ambition but a homecoming. There were grown women crying in the front row, not because the speech was sentimental, because it was true, and they recognized truth the way people who have been lied to enough times recognize it, with a kind of startled relief. The Whitfield Foundation, under Naomi's expanded engagement, launched 3 new scholarship programs targeted at first-generation college students from Atlanta's historically underinvested neighborhoods. Within the first year, the programs would fund over 300 students. Within 5 years, they would be considered among the most significant private scholarship initiatives in the state. Whitfield Fabrics, the family's textile manufacturing company, underwent a strategic modernization under Naomi's direction, a retooling towards sustainable manufacturing processes and domestic supply chain partnerships that attracted significant press coverage and a waiting list of major retail clients who were scrambling to address their own sustainability commitments. And Naomi herself, the woman who had spent 4 years making herself small in a dining room at the end of a long mahogany table, became, without seeking or performing it, one of the most quietly respected figures in Atlanta's business and philanthropic community. She did not change. That was the most remarkable thing about it. She wore the same kind of clothes she had always worn, beautiful now, because she had stopped choosing based on someone else's judgment of her appearance, but simple and elegant in the way that only genuine confidence produces. She kept her old Volvo for another year before finally accepting her mother's argument that it was a liability risk and upgrading to something more reasonable, then donated the Volvo to a high school automotive program, which she thought Ida Whitfield would have appreciated. She was, in every essential way, the same person who had sat in that marriage for 4 years. The difference was that she was no longer editing herself for an audience of one who had never deserved the performance. The world, it turned out, was far more interested in the unedited version. Marcus Carter spent a year following his divorce in a state of managed decline that he was not willing, for a very long time, to accurately describe to himself. Outwardly, he maintained appearances. This was his deepest competency and his most persistent delusion, the ability to present a surface that bore no relationship to the interior. He still wore the Tom Ford suits. He still drove the Mercedes. He still attended events and made handshakes and spoke with the practiced confidence of a man whose life was proceeding as planned. But Darius Webb knew. His attorney knew. And Marcus, in the careful silence of very early mornings when the performance had been set aside for the night, knew. The Meridian was gone, acquired by Whitfield Horizon and transformed into the kind of development that Marcus had told himself he would build if he had more resources, more relationships, more of whatever it was he had always been chasing. The Henderson Street contract had not been recovered. The investors who had pulled back had not returned. New projects were smaller, less well-positioned, funded by relationships that had not yet heard the story clearly enough to make their own judgments. And they were learning, slowly, that such relationships had a shelf life. The Carter Group was not failing. It was contracting, tightening, moving toward a smaller, more local, less connected footprint, exactly the opposite of the trajectory Marcus had imagined for it. It was still a functioning business. It was simply no longer the business it had been, or the one he had always believed it was becoming. And then there was Simone. Simone Vance was a woman who had excellent instincts about value. These instincts had served her well for 34 years. She could assess the real state of a situation with a speed and accuracy that would have made her an extraordinary businessperson in a different life. The instincts that had drawn her toward Marcus Carter, his money, his confidence, his social acceleration, were the same instincts that began quietly recalibrating as the contract shrank and the invitations thinned and the energy of his ambition shifted from forward motion to defensive positioning. It did not end dramatically. Simone was not built for dramatic exits. She began, over the course of a few months, simply being less available, working later, traveling more, having dinners with friends that Marcus was not invited to, in restaurants he had not heard of, with people whose names he did not recognize. The gap between them widened in the quiet, methodical way of a tide going out, not a wave, just a steady withdrawal. When she finally told him she was moving back into her own apartment, she had kept it, he noted bitterly. She had always kept it. She was kind about it, in the way people are kind when they have already grieved something privately and are now simply delivering a conclusion. "Marcus," she said, standing in his kitchen in the same kind of fitted dress she had always worn, her bag on her shoulder, the Cartier bracelet conspicuously not on her wrist. "You are an extraordinary man. But you are a man who needed to marry someone he thought was less than him so he could feel like more. You're never going to find what you're looking for that way. I hope you figure that out." She left. He did not chase her. He didn't have the energy, and somewhere beneath the wounded pride, he suspected she was right. The house felt very large after that. He sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had rehearsed the speech he gave at the divorce dinner, where he had placed the settlement envelope on the table with such confidence, and he felt the particular silence of a life that has been systematically stripped of its performances. No Simone. No expanding business. No social trajectory. No narrative of ascent. Just Marcus Carter, in a house he could no longer quite afford to maintain at its current standard, sitting with the question he had been avoiding for a year. What had he actually wanted? Not Naomi, specifically. He could not afford to think about Naomi, not yet, because thinking about Naomi meant thinking about what he had said to her, and what she had not said back, and what that quiet confidence of hers had actually meant, and he was not ready for the full weight of that. But more broadly, what had he been building toward? What was the vision that had required the dismissal of a woman who was kind and steady, and who had loved him when his apartment was small and his ambitions were just beginning? What had he been trying to become that required her to be less? He did not have an answer. And the absence of an answer was, he was beginning to understand, the most honest and complete assessment of who he had been. It was almost exactly 1 year after the dinner table divorce when Marcus Carter did the thing that every person in his life who cared about him, which was a shorter list now than it had once been, would have told him not to do. He sent Naomi an email. He had written it over 3 evenings, deleting and rewriting, searching for the register that was honest without being pathetic, direct without being presumptuous, clear without being naive. He was a man who communicated in performances, and writing something that was simply true was harder than anything he had attempted in business. The email was not long. He had learned, at least, not to make it longer than it needed to be. It said that he had been thinking about the dinner table, about what he had said and what he had not understood at the time he said it. That he was not writing to ask for anything. He knew, with more clarity than he would have thought himself capable of a year ago, that there was nothing to ask for. That he was writing because he owed her an apology that was not contingent on any response, that did not require her to do anything with it, that was simply the true accounting of what he had done and who he had been. He told her he had spent 4 years making her smaller because her scale made him afraid. He told her he had confused her patience with simplicity, and her dignity with submission, and her restraint with limitation, and that each of these confusions had been entirely his own failure of sight. He told her that watching what she was building, from a distance, from the public record of it, from the city's audible respect for what her family represented, had made him understand something about the difference between ambition and intention, between building for what you want to be seen as and building toward what you actually believe in. He told her he was sorry, specifically and without equivocation. Then he closed the email, read it one final time, and sent it before he could revise it into something less true. 3 weeks passed with no response. He had not expected one. He had told himself he had not expected one. But the absence of a response was still, somehow, felt, not as rejection exactly, but as the appropriate, merited silence of someone who no longer had any particular obligation to be available to him. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 23 days after he had sent the email, a letter arrived by courier. Not an email reply. A letter, on heavy cream stationery, in Naomi's handwriting, careful and unhurried, the penmanship of someone who wrote by hand as a practice rather than a performance. He opened it sitting in his car in the parking garage of his building, because he had a superstition, developed in recent months, that he should receive difficult things in private rather than performing his reception of them for any available audience. The letter said, "Marcus, I received your email. I want you to know that I read it carefully, which is more than I was obligated to do. I am not going to respond in the way that would complete the arc you might be imagining. There is no reconciliation here, no wisdom I can offer that will heal what you need to heal or rebuild what you need to rebuild. That is yours to do. But I will say this, I do not need your apology, and I never needed your acknowledgement to know my own worth. I always knew. What I needed 4 years ago was for you to know it. You couldn't then. Perhaps you're beginning to now. I hope you become someone you respect. That is the only foundation that has ever mattered. Naomi." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, against his chest. He sat in the parking garage for a long time. The fluorescent lights hummed. A car pulled in 2 spaces over and its occupant left without noticing him. The city went about its afternoon work in the muffled distance. Marcus Carter, who had not cried since his father's funeral 11 years ago, found his eyes wet in the quiet of a concrete parking garage, alone with a letter from a woman he had dismissed as ordinary, holding the specific grief of a man who has finally understood what he has lost at precisely the moment when understanding it no longer helps. The Whitfield Horizon groundbreaking ceremony made the front page of Atlanta Business Weekly, a photograph that would circulate widely online and be shared with the particular enthusiasm reserved for images that tell a story without requiring any words. In the photograph, Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes stood at the center of a small crowd, a ceremonial silver shovel in her gloved hands, her head thrown back in laughter at something the mayor had apparently just said. She was wearing a hard hat over her natural hair, a trim blazer in a deep terracotta color, and her grandmother's pearl earrings. To her left, her father, Dr. Gerald Barnes, silver-haired and broadly smiling, had his arm around her shoulder. To her right, her mother Constance stood straight and still, her silver locks luminous, her expression containing 5 generations of something that defied easy naming but looked, from the outside, like vindication. Behind them, the stone facade of a Whitfield-Barnes building built in 1951 was visible, the cornerstone with its carved initials catching the morning sun. The article accompanying the photograph was not about Marcus Carter. It was not about the divorce. It mentioned neither of them in any particular way. It was about Naomi, about the Whitfield-Barnes legacy, about the development project, about the scholarship programs, about the woman who was, as the journalist wrote, bringing one of Atlanta's oldest and most quietly consequential legacies fully into the light, and doing so with the effortless authority of someone who has always known exactly who she is. Marcus Carter read the article on his phone on a Wednesday morning. He looked at the photograph for a long time, at the laughter on her face, at the way her father held her, at the building behind them, rooted in soil that had been Whitfield soil for 70 years. He put the phone down. He made himself coffee. He went to his office and did the work that was his to do, the smaller, humbler, more honest work of rebuilding a career that had been inflated beyond its actual foundation and would have to be reconstructed from a more truthful starting point. He was not destroyed. That was important to understand. The world had not ended for Marcus Carter. He would continue. He would build. He would, in time and with the kind of difficulty that turns men either bitter or wise, become someone different than who he had been. Whether he became the better version was a question that only time and his own choices would answer. But he would not be given what he had thrown away. That was gone completely. There was no version of the future in which Naomi Whitfield-Barnes needed Marcus Carter for anything. There was no version in which the scale had reset to zero and he could approach her from a level playing field and try again. The scale had not reset. The scale had simply been revealed for what it had always been, and she stood where she had always stood, and the distance between where he was and where she was had always been exactly what it was. It just looked different now that the lights were on. He had offered her $30,000 and a used car. She had left the ring on the table and walked out into a morning that was already hers. That is what pride costs, when it is built on the sand of other people's diminishment rather than the bedrock of genuine accomplishment. It costs you the thing you cannot replace. Not the money. Not the project. Not the social position. The thing that was rare and real and willing to love you plainly, in cotton dresses and old cars, for nothing more than who you actually were. Marcus Carter had looked at Naomi Whitfield-Barnes every day for 4 years and had not seen her. That was not a failure of information. It was a failure of sight. And you cannot retrofit sight. You cannot go back and see what you refuse to look at. You can only carry the knowledge of what you missed into whatever comes next and hope that it makes you different enough not to make the same mistake again. On a Saturday morning in late October, Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes sat on the wraparound porch of the Buckhead estate, in the same chair where her grandmother had shelled peas on summer evenings, listening to the Atlanta Braves on the radio. She had brought the old radio out of storage from the back of the house. It was a portable RCA from 1983, slightly yellowed, with an antenna that needed to be angled precisely to the northeast to pick up the signal without static. Her grandmother had known the exact angle by memory. Naomi was still figuring it out. The morning was clear and cool. The magnolias along the front drive had turned, their leaves in the particular gold and rust of late autumn, the branches heavy and deliberate in the still air. The city was audible in the distance, that constant low murmur of Atlanta doing what Atlanta did, building and rebuilding and tearing down and beginning again. But here on the porch it was separate from all that. Here it was still. Her mother came out with 2 cups of tea and sat in the chair beside her. They listened to the game without talking for a while. There was an ease between them, the kind built over decades, that did not require filling. "Kayla Monroe called," Constance said eventually. "She wants to do a longer profile. A full feature." "I know. She emailed me. Are you going to do it?" Naomi considered the question, looking out at the magnolias. There was something compelling about visibility now, about the idea of the Whitfield story being told more fully, not for her own sake but for the sake of the younger women who needed to understand that this kind of legacy was possible, had always been possible, that it had been being built by black women's hands since 1918. There was something worth telling there. Something that had nothing to do with her divorce and everything to do with Ida Whitfield and a laundry service and a single commercial property deed purchased in the year that shaped the world her grandmother would inherit. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it. But the focus has to be on the family. On great-great-grandmother Ida. On what 100 years of intention actually builds. That's the story. That's always been the story," her mother said, and handed her the tea. They sat on the porch until the game ended. The Braves won, which Naomi took as a sign of nothing in particular but appreciated nonetheless. The light moved across the garden in its steady, indifferent way. A cardinal appeared in the magnolia nearest the porch, bright red, impossible to miss, and sat for a moment before disappearing into the leaves. Naomi thought about Ida Whitfield, who had stood in front of a deed that most of Atlanta had not believed she could be able to hold, and had simply held it. Who had built from that single acre and those calloused hands a legacy that was still growing 100 years later, still funding scholarships and developing communities and protecting its own name in every room that mattered. Who had never asked permission for any of it. Who had simply known, with that particular certainty that belongs to people who have reckoned with themselves completely, what she was worth and what she was building and why it mattered. Naomi came from that woman. She had always come from that woman. Even in the dining room with the white linen and the settlement envelope on the table, even in the 4 years of cotton dresses and deliberate smallness, she had always been Ida Whitfield's great-great-granddaughter. She had never stopped being that. She had simply been waiting to let everyone else see it. The waiting was over. She picked up her grandmother's old radio, angled the antenna 3 degrees northeast, and listened to the city humming in the October afternoon. Atlanta, building itself again. Her city. Her family's city. The one they had been part of since before most of its current residents had been born. Naomi Elise Whitfield-Barnes smiled. Not the performed smile she had worn at the end of that long mahogany table. Not the patient smile of a woman waiting for a man to understand what he had. But the full, private smile of a person who is exactly where they belong. And she sat with her mother on the porch of the house where she was from, and she was at peace. There is a particular kind of blindness that wealth and ambition produce in men who have built themselves from nothing. It is not malicious, exactly, though it produces malicious effects. It is the blindness of a man who has learned to measure everything, who has spent his whole life evaluating and comparing and positioning, who has become so skilled at reading the surface of things that he has lost entirely the ability to look beneath them. Marcus Carter looked at Naomi Whitfield-Barnes and saw cotton dresses and a modest apartment, and a quiet disposition, and he read these as data points about her value. He did not have the depth of vision to see, that they were deliberate choices made by a woman who understood something fundamental about the world that he never had, that the quality of a person is not displayed in what they wear or drive or where they live. It is expressed in how they move through difficulty with dignity intact. It is expressed in the patience they bring to questions that have no quick answers. It is expressed in whether they know, even when the world is not looking, who they are. Naomi always knew. That is the thing about generational legacy, the real kind, the kind built over 100 years of intention and care, that no one who hasn't grown up inside it ever fully understands. It is not about the money, though the money is real and significant. It is about what the money represents. 100 years of people who looked at a world that told them they were worth less, and said with their hands and their deeds and their children's educations and their carefully maintained institutions, no. We know what we are worth, and we are building accordingly. Naomi grew up inside that. She breathed it. It was the water she swam in. And so when a man told her she had never brought much to the table, the words slid off her the way water slides off something that is already fully, completely itself. She did not need him to know her worth. She already knew. Marcus spent his life trying to build an image. Naomi spent hers simply being. In the end, the image was the thing that cracked under pressure, and the being was the thing that remained. There is a lesson in this that goes beyond Naomi and Marcus, beyond divorce and real estate and Atlanta and all the particular details of their particular story. It is the lesson that every person who has ever been underestimated, and especially every black woman who has been asked, in 1,000 ways large and small, to make herself smaller so that someone else could feel larger, already knows in their bones but sometimes needs to hear spoken aloud. Your value is not a negotiation. It is not contingent on whether it is recognized. It exists whether it is seen or not. The silence in which you hold it is not weakness. It is protection. It is patience. It is the long game of a woman who knows that the world, given enough time, shows everyone exactly who they are. Marcus Carter learned this. He learned it in the hard and specific way that men like him tend to learn things, through loss, through public consequence, through the slow stripping away of every illusion until he was left with nothing but the truth of his own choices. And Naomi? Naomi was already on the porch, listening to the radio, in the house that her great-great-grandmother's hands had made possible, letting the October light move across the garden she had been returning to her whole life. She was not waiting for anything anymore. She had already arrived. If this story moved you, if Naomi's quiet strength made you sit up straighter, if Marcus's blindness made your jaw tighten, if the image of Ida Whitfield buying a property deed in 1918 with callous seamstress hands made something rise up in your chest, then you already understand why we tell these stories. Because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are mirrors. They show us the cost of arrogance and the power of patience. They remind us that legacy is built over generations, not announcements. They confirm what the wisest among us already know, that the people the world underestimates are often the ones holding the deed. At Story Cave, we bring you these stories because they need to be heard. By the woman in the cotton dress who has been told she doesn't fit in. By the man who is still confusing image with substance and learning it the hard way. By every person who has ever been dismissed and felt the particular, clarifying fire of knowing they would outlast the dismissal. We are Story Cave, and we are just getting started. If this story stayed with you, please like this video. Leave a comment telling us your favorite moment, or share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Story Cave so you never miss a story that was worth waiting for. Because the best ones always are.